My name is David Boyes. I work for Public Services International, which is a global federation of trade unions in public services. We represent about 20 million workers in 160 countries. My direct responsibility is to work on the files of energy, water, waste, and pension funds. So I think if I'm going to try to outline a little bit about what's going on in public services, I think it would be useful to talk about water first. Because as everybody knows, without water you're dead in 5-6 days. You're dead. The other thing that isn't so well known is that 50% of the hospital beds in the world are filled with people suffering waterborne diseases. That means they don't have access to potable water, they can't afford it, the government hasn't brought it to them, and so many people suffer and die because of this lack of a fundamental public service. Why don't they have this public service? The issue is pretty complex. The question is, well, a lot of people say it's too expensive. Actually, it's not. It is expensive, but at the level of a national budget, it's affordable. For all but, let's say, 30 of the poorest countries. They can afford it out of their own budgets. So then why don't they do it? Well, because water is not so sexy. Water, you have a reservoir far from your city, you have pipes that are all underground, you have a treatment station to filter all the shit. It's not sexy. So governments would rather spend money on weapons or on high-profile roads, on other sorts of infrastructure. The other problem can be when democracy or when governments don't work well enough, and that is a problem. When the money is sidetracked into Swiss bank accounts, or when the waterworks are put in the hands of political favorites and not competent people. So these are a number of the problems. We also see that our own members are paid very poor wages, very poor wages. So for them, there's not very much incentive to provide a good service. In fact, a number of them are paid so low that they can't afford to feed their families and have to get second jobs. So there's a lot of problems human resource-wise, there's a lot of problems finance-wise, there's a lot of problems of political will. In energy, it's pretty much the same thing. We see if you fly over Africa at night, it's dark. It is the dark continent. They don't have modern electrical power available. And what we know is that it is impossible to grow a business if you don't have reliable electricity. It's impossible to run a hospital. Schools, very difficult to run without electricity. So we see that electricity and water are the two key building blocks for modern societies. Absolutely fundamental. Electricity is much more complicated than water because you have divisions in civil society about how to produce it. Do you produce it using coal, using oil, using hydro, which means big dams, using natural gas, using nuclear? How do you produce it? Now you're seeing the push to wind and solar and geothermal, but it's so expensive that nobody's going to do it. So the private sector won't do it until they get massive public guarantees. So what we're also seeing is a major push for privatization in a lot of these services. And I haven't even spoken about health. I haven't spoken about municipal services, transport. All of these cost money. Governments nowadays, especially now with the global financial crisis, where governments have been forced to bail out the banks, and where jobs are less so people can pay fewer income taxes, what we're seeing now is governments have emptied their coffers, have spent all their money on the banks, and now they have to spend money on unemployment insurance, on food stamps, on food support, yet they have less money. So what are the governments doing? They're engaging in austerity measures. So what they're saying is we must reduce our spending, we must pay off our debt, and we must collect, well, some of them say we must collect more taxes, but off working people, not off corporations. So we're seeing a confluence of contradictory trends which mean that citizens and working people are getting less and less on which to live. They're finding it harder and harder to make ends meet, to enjoy a decent standard of living. Even if they have the will to work, even if they are working, they're finding that the social supports for their families are getting fewer and fewer. Hence, the governments have been pushing for privatization for a number of years, with the theory that A, the market is more effective and more efficient than public services, B, that the private sector can better capture the risk of making decisions about who gets access to services, what happens when you're not rich enough. So it's held that the private sector can manage those risks very well. The market allocates resources to where they're most effectively used. And finally, another assumption is that the private sector will bring its own money to invest. But what we're seeing, the experience of the past 15, 20 years, is that's not working. The private sector will not risk its own money. That in many public services, competition doesn't exist. In water, in electricity, very hard to have actual real competition because of the cost of these heavy network services. So what we see is that when the private sector comes in, they end up replacing a public monopoly with a private monopoly, and the only real difference is any savings that are made are taken out as in profits and sent out of the country for further mergers and acquisitions and other corporate extravagances. So what we're seeing in many developing countries is that the model of privatization has totally failed, in part because they don't bring their money. When they do come in and use government money, they export profits at a level of 20 to 25% per year, exporting those profits rather than reinvesting them. And fundamentally, and it's a discussion we hear about corporate social responsibility, the corporations are not able to absorb the social and environmental needs. They can only focus on profit maximization. So if you bring a public service where you have to make non-profitable decisions, the corporations can't do it. So we find them, for example, avoiding regulation. And we see a number of private water companies, it can happen with publics too, they're not all saints, they will pollute with their effluents. They will pollute the water because they know that they won't get caught. The regulations say you cannot put more than 1 part per million chlorine in your wastewater. But if you get caught, you will end up paying a small fine. So the financial imperatives of the private sector say, if we only get caught 1 time out of 10, and if that time when we get caught we only pay a small fine, it costs us less to violate the regulation and run the risk of getting caught. And then when we get caught, we'll pay a small fine. So we see a distortion of the imperatives. We also see bribery. Getting a hold of long-term public service contracts can be very valuable. So how do you get a hold of them? You bribe. You pay money. So when we talk about corruption, everybody talks about the countries in the South are all corrupt. Bullshit. It's about the profit-seeking northern corporations bringing in the bribing mechanisms and basically corrupting the process. But also, even when they do normally without bribery, the process of commercial secrecy, of protecting your commercial secrets, also distorts the democratic process. We have a case in Casablanca where there were only 4 or 5 people who saw the contract for a 25-year water concession. Only 4 or 5 people saw the contract because it's a commercial secret. So all these trends mean that for us, for our members, but also for a lot of people in civil society, the privatization and marketization and financialization of everything is failing dismally. So what do? We oppose it. You have to research and know what the dynamics of privatization are, who the privateers are, who their allies are, in order to block it. And we've got to spread that knowledge throughout the communities. But it's not enough just to say no. What do we stand for? So when we look at, again, the water sector, we are initiating a series of processes of public-public partnerships, where strong utilities help weak ones. They don't seek profit. They do it out of solidarity. Their costs are made whole, but it's an alternative to the public-private partnership. So we are working with the UN, we're working with local authorities, we're working with national governments, we're working with public operators to create a network of public-public partnerships between the utilities with the participation of workers and citizens in decision-making. So that's just one small example of what we're trying to do here. We're working with the REDFAL, Federações das Autoridades Locais, to work with them to make the awareness that local authorities who deliver most of the public services have to engage in the global policy making, but also have to support their public utilities to engage in public-public partnerships. So that's one example. We're working here at different levels. We're working on the financial transaction tax because we believe that a lot of the speculation that's going on, whether it's financial speculation, commodity speculation, is making undeserved gains. Undeserved gains that are going to a tiny minority of the world's richest. And we believe that they must be taxed. Corporates and the speculators must be taxed. I would say we have to go further. We have to take a number of these issues out of speculation. We must break some of the market control of our lives. And that, I think, is a huge fight where the trade unions in the public sector are opening up to the citizens who depend on our services, are opening up to pressure the political leaders and all the multilateral institutions of the UN and the banks to create a more just and equitable society for all of our citizens, not just our members, but our families, our communities.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Which is a global federation of trade unions in public services. We represent about 20 million workers in 160 countries. My direct responsibility is to work on the files of energy, water, waste, and pension funds. So I think if I'm going to try to outline a little bit about what's going on in public services, I think it would be useful to talk about water first. Because as everybody knows, without water you're dead in 5-6 days. You're dead. The other thing that isn't so well known is that 50% of the hospital beds in the world are filled with people suffering waterborne diseases. That means they don't have access to potable water, they can't afford it, the government hasn't brought it to them, and so many people suffer and die. My name is David Boys. I work for Public Services International. Water, you have a reservoir far from your city, you have pipes that are all underground, you have a treatment station to filter all the shit. It's not sexy. So governments would rather spend money on weapons or on high-profile roads, on other sorts of infrastructure. The other problem can be when democracy or when governments don't because of this lack of a fundamental public service. Why don't they have this public service? The issue is pretty complex. The question is, well, a lot of people say it's too expensive. Actually, it's not. It is expensive, but at the level of a national budget, it's affordable. For all but, let's say, 30 of the poorest countries. They can afford it out of their own budgets. So then, why don't they do it? Well, because water is not so sexy.